You.
Correct.
Well, I probably ought to start the meeting. I'm Connie Nestor. I think most of you know me, and just want to welcome everyone to the Scottish American History Forum today. And just to remind you, the History Forum is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots, formerly the Illinois St. Andrew Society, which founded the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois. And this was back in 1845, and it was later named Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. It's located in North Riverside, Illinois. Chicago Scots is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of Scottish culture, in addition to support of the Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care Campus. For additional information, please access our website at www.chicagoscots.org. And we ask everyone to please remember to give generously to our charity. It's a senior care mission that all Scots can be proud of. So now, before we begin our presentation today with our esteemed speaker, Professor Graeme Morton, who will be entertaining question, answer, and discussion after the presentation, we do have Gus Noble here with us today. And Gus, we're delighted you're with us. Gus is president of Chicago Scots, and he's going to formally now greet everyone for our video recording. And Gus, maybe you can update us on what's going on at Caledonia and so forth.
Well, thank you, Connie and Graeme. I'm delighted you're going to be speaking to us today. It's always good to spend time with you. I always feel smarter having spent time with you.
Ooh, dangerous.
Life at Caledonia is fun as ever. Unfortunately, we've had a couple of instances of COVID, but fortunately symptoms are very mild. And, I'm ever so proud of our staff for the way they handled times during the most extreme periods of lockdown. We kept everyone safe, didn't lose a single resident, and it's testament to the vigilance and care of our great team there. The same will happen now, though, as I say, symptoms are much, much milder than they were previously. I would say this is, I think, the first history forum we've had since our Highland Games, and indications are that we've had one of the best games ever from an attendance perspective and from a financial revenue perspective. We had the largest pipe band championship in North America with 41 pipe bands, I think, and when they all got together at the end and played the Salute to the Chieftain in tribute to Gordon McAnally, who Don mentioned, for only the second time in history, the president of Rotary International worldwide service organization was from Scotland, and we asked if he would accept the Salute to the Chieftain on behalf of all the Rotarians around the world, but especially those locally in Chicago who represented our honored clan. He said yes, and it was a moment when the bands all played Scotland the Brave, and he stood there. He came up afterwards and said, I could not have wished for a better send-off to my term as president. It ended just a few days after the Highland Games, so it was like a fanfare of his finale for his time here. I thank everyone for coming and for their support, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Graeme's presentation.
Well, thank you, Gus. Thank you for those words of inspiration, and congratulations on a successful festival. I just want to present a wee reminder before we begin the presentation today, and just let you know that on August 10th, Dr. Sarah McCausland-Jenneck, who is the Department Chair of History and Interdisciplinary Studies at the Indian Creek School in Maryland, is going to be with us to speak on the history, nature, and relevance of Scottish foods. So that should be interesting. And then on September 14th, Dr. Michael Brown, professor and chair in Irish, Scottish, and Enlightenment history from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, it will be with us to address Failing to Make Peace, Adam Ferguson, the Carlisle Commission, and the Scottish Enlightenment in America. So I hope you'll all be able to make time to join us for these very interesting discussions. And so now, or Professor Graeme, we're going to turn the presentation over to you. I'd like everybody to please mute your microphones and dim your cameras until after Dr. Morton's presentation, when we'll turn our mics back on and reinitiate our cameras, and I can assist you with that. But on that happy note, Graeme, thank you so much for making time for us today. We're just dying to hear what you have to say.
Great, thank you, Connie. Thank you, Gus. And what a wonderful program you've got coming up. You've got some great speakers lined up, I can guarantee that. So, Connie, can I just check that you can still see the PowerPoint?
I cannot see it. Can others see it?
You might not be able to. Let's do that again.
Okay. Yes, there it is, and it exactly.
That should be now
Thank
full
you.
screen. Right, there we go. Yes, I was fiddling with the controls, which is never a good thing to be doing, but there you go. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for giving up your morning, or if you're in Scotland, as Connie is, your afternoon, to hear about really some investigations by some of the earliest scientists who were interested in what was a new discipline called meteorology. You can go back as far as you like to find people interested in their climate and their history around and the weather around them. And the very beginnings of climatology really started in astronomy. So the astronomers got in there first, and they had a theory. They had theories of astronomy that could then, it was thought, influence the work of a new science of meteorology. Because as you can kind of imagine, a lot of meteorology is about collecting information, collecting weather statistics, heat, temperature, air pressure in particular. We've got barometers really becoming quite popular from the end of the early 19th century, certainly up to the end of the 19th century. We've got thermometers much earlier than that. But it was a collection of facts. It was a bit like antiquarianism. What have we got to do with all this data? How do we make sense of it? And we're certainly trying to make sense of it today. This is just last week, the Guardian newspaper in the UK has quoted the Copernicus climate change group, who have come to the conclusion that we're now averaging 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial average. So the 12 months of world temperature is now 1.5 degrees centigrade above what it was in what they call the pre-industrial period. The pre-industrial period I'll come to talk about a little bit later, but is effectively we're looking at 1850 to 1900. So it's a period of industrialization, but not yet when industrial change is having the impact that we see here in California in the image that's used by the Guardian to try and talk about a heat haze here. And as everyone was coming in to the talk today, I've been sitting here gobsmacked at some of the temperatures that you're reporting from various parts of the US in particular. And talking to my colleague in British Columbia yesterday, and she as well was expecting a heat wave and also forest fires to come as they did last year. So climate history is very much part of the current science, understanding climate history, because it's so important to understanding climate future. And that, as I mentioned earlier, can be seen here in Dundee with the coming of the Eden Centre, which is a series of again, exhibitions, but really working science to allow people to understand both the climate past and climate future together. So we're very excited that the Eden Centre has chosen Dundee and be part of the regeneration along the riverside of Dundee, not the riverside at Chicago, Illinois, but here the riverside in Dundee. So temperature change is very much at the background here. And this is one of the well-known graphs that you'll often see presented. This is the version coming out of the Met Office, the Meteorological Office in the UK. But this is to show you again the temperature change over primarily that growth in that's happening after 1900. By the 1930s in particular, you start to see a rise in average temperatures. This is Northern Hemisphere. The same data can be mapped and has been mapped for the Southern Hemisphere and for the globe as a whole. But you can see here that pre-industrial average that they're referring to is that period there from about 1850, certainly up to about 1900 or 1930 at the latest. And then it's the temperature change thereafter that is of particular concern to scientists. So I'm interested though as a historian, I'm a historian of the 19th century, so that's the period that I'm particularly interested in. Also because it's a period when we start to get the history of meteorology and the gathering of those statistics. The statistics start in 1850 because effectively that is when we get meteorological departments established in the US, in England, Scotland a year later, Scotland in 1855, and also around Europe. So 1853, as you'll come to hear in a moment, is an important date in the organisation of governments interested in understanding meteorology and gathering statistics in a systematic way, as opposed to, which had been the norm in the 18th century, gardeners, estate owners, school teachers, amateur scientists collecting data in their own backyard. And we have a lot of that. But we also now have, beginning from the 1850s, we now have long-term statistical data. And so one of the guys who is very much at the heart of this, we give thanks to an American, Admiral Matthew Fontaine Maury, who has lovely sort of epitaphs. But the idea of the pathfinder of the sea is a great title for anyone. And Maury is someone we can identify as being at the forefront of the organization or the state organization of meteorological research. And he did it primarily in his life as a naval officer. He was appointed to the United States Observatory in 1844, but he gathered his data from US vessels, military, the US Navy in particular was deployed with the equipment to go and measure strength and direction of water flows and also ocean depth. The US government was the first to actually fund this kind of research. And Maury therefore becomes a leader in the promotion of, firstly, finding direction through the seas, but also in terms of surface temperature, both on land and also in sea temperature as well. And I say it comes down to 1853, there's a major conference on trying to standardize the measurements of meteorological observations. Maury is the man that's leading the way on this. And the UK, following in the footsteps, sends 2 Royal Navy captains to Brussels to try and understand what's going on. You can see that it's not the scientists, it's not the Royal Society of London or even the Royal Society of Edinburgh who are sending people. It's the British government is sending 2 Royal Navy captains to find out what Matthew Fontaine Maury is proposing. So this is the beginnings of the story. And I thought I could explain it, but I thought I could maybe explain it even better with a little bit of a film that didn't quite win an Oscar, but it was there nominated. And this is the year after Gone with the Wind. And this is Profit Without Honor. And so with great credit to Turner Classic Movies, I'm just going to play you 2 or 3 minutes of the biography of Maury, because it gets you the sense of the great white man here, and it's very hagiographic, but it gives you a sense of the excitement around the work that he did and the challenge. So we can sort of doubt about the great white man and the great heroic figure, but I think this is someone we need to acknowledge. So here we go.
time safely transport us to our distant destination, the Siren Sea, that vast enigma whose call some men can never resist. Of these is Matthew Fontaine Maury, a country boy of Virginia, fired with nautical ambition, wanted a midshipman in the United States Navy in this year of our Lord, 1825. With unflagging industry, he studies the science of the sea. And most of all that fascinates Matt Maury are the age-old treacherous tricks and unsolved mysteries of the trackless waters. So in rapid course and with almost fabulous facility, the sea-struck young Matt passes his examinations and becomes a full-fledged naval officer at the tender age of 25. But one day, on shore leave to visit his family who have been so skeptic, even opposed to his chosen career, fate deals a hand. An overturned coach, only one person injured, Matthew Fontaine Maury, who had given up his seat in the crowded coach to a woman, and hence was an easy victim riding on top when disaster came. So now a cripple for life, and despite all his frantic appeals for duty afloat, destined to live out his once promising career in the routine shore duty of a stuffy bureau. And thus end your dreams, Matt Maury. Not for you again to grip the wheel in the teeth of a howling gale with the salt spray whipping your face. Never again in some unknown sea will you shoot the sun and scan the stars and, magic of all magic, place your finger on an untracked chart and say, my ship is here. No, books and papers are your lot now. Books that can only drip acid into the wounds of your landlocked soul. Logbooks of ships long since deep in Davy Jones' locker. But take heart, Matt Maury. These old records may at least unfurl the sails of your mind and bellow them into life with the winds of your imagination. There's many a dream voyage ahead of you, recapturing the glowing surge of ocean wave by reliving these bygone voyages. But what's this? Such a wind and such a current in that longitude and latitude, recorded untold years ago. Why, that's a strange coincidence. Only last year I took observations in the very same spot, and I remember noting identical conditions of wind and water. I must look into this. Wouldn't it be odd if there were natural laws governing the ocean? And so Matt Maury sails on 1,000 ships to 10,000 different ports, studying, noting, comparing, until he is the first man that ever lived who knows the way of the wind and the water. The first man in all history to comprehend nature's system of storms and doldrums. No guesswork this, but hitherto unknown.
There you go. Look at that. Who can write a script like that nowadays, I ask you? Very impressive. Oh, there we go. So that was Maury. And you can look that up yourself on YouTube and it's on Turner Classic Movies, and it's just a 10-minute one reel Oscar nominee. So it's very but that's the language is amazing. But there's a couple of things that are really interesting there, which is, I think perhaps the most important is the search for the laws of the weather, laws of climate laws, laws of meteorology, as well as laws of the ocean. This is a general philosophical attempt that was also seen in terms of medicine in this period as well, as if there were standard laws that could be discerned. And if only we got enough data, we could discern those laws and therefore follow them. And that's what Maury tried to do. And this was then followed in the UK when Admiral Robert Fitzroy was then charged with becoming the first meteorological statist. So it's a guy who's gathering the data in the Board of Trade. And you can see the links here. It's the Royal Navy here in the UK. It's also the Board of Trade. So military means imperial activity, but also in terms of trade. Those were the main concerns of government. And that's why they would then put money into supporting meteorological research. Fitzroy is also known as the commander of a certain ship called the Beagle, who had as his scientific officer a certain Charles Darwin. He also became Governor General of New Zealand, but he was someone else who was desk bound in the end, and he got himself obsessed by all the data he could gather and was sent to him to undertake meteorological research. So he becomes the head of the meteorological department in the Board of Trade in London in 1854, but this doesn't include Scotland. Scotland has to have its own society. It feels itself excluded from the Met Office down in London. So we then get the creation of the Scottish Meteorological Society in 1855. Its main activity, its first headline there, is to understand the leading features of climate in different districts of Scotland. And you can see then on the slide there, its subordinate objectives, issues of public health, the spread of epidemics, very much interested in agriculture and horticulture, and some of the earliest leaders of this particular society came out of the Royal Agricultural Society. And so that link between understanding sort of Enlightenment ideas about how to improve agricultural outputs and how that can perhaps keep people on the land in the Highlands, that was again part of whether this new science of meteorology could help. But also in terms of trying to find laws to show the recurrence of wind, the recurrence of rain, when's it going to be the most important times. Indeed, the most important secretary of the Scottish Meteorological Society, a guy called Alexander Buchan, he becomes famous after his death for creating the Buchan spells. The Buchan spells were when it was deemed to be the best weather around Easter. And in the UK, legislation was passed for a fixed Easter Act. So there is legislation to fix the date of Easter at a certain 2 weeks that coincided with the best weather as identified by Alexander Buchan. This act passed in the 1920s, but it was never followed through. So the act exists, it's just never been enacted, it's never been followed through because world denominations, churches would not agree on when Easter should be. Yeah, it's not something that's fixed by a fixed date. So, but they were looking under these scientists, these early scientists were looking to find various laws that they could then explain the reoccurrence. When's the best time to plant? When's the best time for harvest? When are we likely to have rain? But also, when are we going to have storms? Really important for trade, when so much of the trade is based on water. Dundee, for example, the Dundee docks setting out, bringing in of jute from India and then exporting the Hessian bags that are then used for carrying, the jute bags that are used for carrying grain all around the world. You know, incredibly important to know when there's going to be a storm or when there's not. So it becomes important as part of imperialism, and it becomes important to try and bring science into agriculture, but also into public health as well. And those are some of the issues that I'll be talking about. And Maury there's a letter from Maury supporting the Scottish Meteorological Society. It was quoted at the very opening of the campaign, the prospectus, to get people to subscribe to this new society. It's a classic voluntary society. They wanted people, come up, pay your subscription, you can join it. It's a bit like the origins of the Illinois St. Andrew Society or any other voluntary organization. You ask people to subscribe. And it did the same, and it used a letter from Maury, who came to Glasgow in the 1860s, a little bit later, but here in 1855, he's found supporting the intentions of the Scottish Meteorological Society. And perhaps the greatest achievement this particular society did was to build an observatory on the top of Ben Nevis. This lasted from 1883 to 1904. It's no longer there. They ran out of funds. But it's interesting that this is, if you're looking, part of my life, I studied the history of nationalism, and it's interesting that this is one of those examples of an initiative that the Scottish scientists were behind, but they could not get treasury funding from London, and eventually had to do it their own way, kept it going as much as they could, some support from the Royal Society in London, but without further public funding, it's something that came to the end. But it's a really good case study you can look at, the Ben Nevis Observatory, and to try and raise money, they charge people to make a telephone call from the top. Some of the excitement that you could do, because there it was important because you could chart the wind direction, the storm directions coming over Scotland at its highest point. So incredibly useful data that was gathered. And the guy of the three gentlemen in the middle there, the guy on the right is the guy called Mossman, and he went off to Argentina and the Falkland Islands where he collected a lot of data, but also he did some of the best work that we have on long-term meteorological data for Scotland. So it was an important activity for a while, but it shows the history of meteorology in Scotland, very much done as a voluntary organisation, enthusiastic scientists, support from the medical profession, support also from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and some support from London, but not sufficient treasury support. But they were very active in setting up a number of meteorological points of observation. They took evidence from someone like Charles Clouston, who did some of the best measurements for the Orkney Islands, did it through the 1820s, but there's data from Clouston coming through to the 1850s and 1860s. And the Scottish Meteorological Society was very much involved in collecting that kind of data, and it all got processed by at the Royal Observatory in Calton Hill. The Astronomer Royal was involved in collating the data, brought it together, sent it down to London, used a telegraph to send it to London to try and chart wind direction, storm direction, and air pressure in particular. So a lot more data coming in the 1850s and 1860s, which becomes really important to try and develop these laws of meteorology. As Clouston put it, looking for a Newton of meteorology. But until we get to that stage, he points out it must be pleasing to God as well as beneficial to man to throw light on any of these laws. And Clouston himself was a Church of Scotland minister, trained as a doctor, keen botanist, but also very keen collector of meteorological data as well. Oh, there we go. Oops, next slide. And as I say, loads and loads of data. This is one of these projects where you could spend your entire life trying to collect the data. So historians are usually keen when they come across more and more data, but when you start getting daily data and then twice daily and then hourly data, then you start to lose the will to carry on with this project. But these are some of the data sets that you can access through these are available through the Met Office down in London. Well, it's in the southeast of England rather. We can see here there's data going right back to this list here is from the 1770s, but actually back to 1766. We've got some good runs of data, as well as there's lots of diary data as well. But the systematic recording of weather in Scotland, 1820s, then again in the 1850s. That's when we really start to see it. And if you're interested, there's over 3,500 different sites of weather data you can access. It doesn't have rain in Scotland. People are obsessed with gathering that kind of information. If you've ever seen Billy Connolly's World Tour of Scotland, when he comes to Dundee and goes to Dundee Law and says, we've been filming here for 15 minutes, and literally we've had 4 seasons in that time. It helps explain why the Scots have been very good at gathering meteorological data. So there's lots of it. Okay, let's go live. So Mossman, who I mentioned earlier, produced this run of data. This is our longest run that we have for Edinburgh. This is the longest run we have in Scotland, and it goes from Edinburgh from 1764, and we can take it right up to the present day. So we've got it's more or less complete. There's a bit of a gap with the guy Alexander Adie, who recorded this data where he kind of disappeared for a while, and the data has been filled in from Dunfermline. So this is not, and Dunfermline's in Fife. It's maybe what 30-40 miles from Edinburgh. A bit further if you drive, but just by geography, it's not too distant. But this is the longest run that we have. And we also have it for wind data as well, but this is just looking at temperature. And what it's showing you here is some of the temperature peaks and falls. It's all in Fahrenheit that we have here. And you can see the 1770s is a warmer period. And also what's an interesting one is if you can see here in the 1840s, 1846, this becomes a peak temperature right before the potato blight hits the Highlands. We actually get Scotland's warmest summer just in advance of that period of potato blight. So there's arguments around that. The climatological arguments you can look at. You can also look at the cold of 1816, and this is a year without summer. And this is a result of volcanic action in Iceland. And it takes a year up to 3 years for the sulfuric acid in the clouds, the cloud cover, to come over and impact Scotland. So we see that in the 1860s, and also Krakatoa happening here in the 1880s as well. So you can see Scotland's temperature being impacted by events elsewhere in the world, but also there's various peaks, but a general rise. Over the trend line is showing a general rise over the period here. So this is 1764 up to 1896. If I'd extended it and looked, as I say, from the 1930s, then you really do see temperature rise in Scotland. And the next table, the next graph, rather shows you these decades to show you which ones are the warmest, which are the coldest. So, oh, sorry, going back here. If you look here, the coldest, 1811, 1812, period of coming back from the Napoleonic Wars, is a period of quite a lot of hardship in Scotland, but also the 1760s. This is when we look at a lot of migration into America, for example, the real start of that, or in real numbers, is coming from the 1760s and 1770s. So that's a period of Highland emigration, particularly to America. And these are 2 decades where we see particularly cold temperatures there. So you can see the average line there is 46.8 degrees Fahrenheit, or 8.2 centigrade. That's the average over the period 1764 to 1896. But we can see those decades there in the 1760s and 1770s are cold. And then also that warmth right at the end, the last 5 years, 1891 to 96, but also that period that includes the potato blight in the 1840s. The 1840s is often called the hungry 40s. It's a period of food shortages in Scotland. There's also a period of warmth, so what are the connections there? And that's some of those questions were asked by contemporary meteorologists. Was there an impact between the timing of harvest, when rain fell, even how long the winter season lasted, how late was there frost, for example? But those are the decadal averages there that, as I say, contemporary meteorologists looked at. What else have we got? Well, this, as I said, the Scottish Meteorological Society was interested in just charting the variations across Scotland. It was also interested in agriculture, and that last slide spoke to that. But by the 1850s, or even argue a little bit earlier, if you're looking at cities, there was interest in the impact of climate difference on health. And this involved a guy called James Stark in particular. For those of you who do your family history and go to Scotland's People and look at the census, well, the person that writes up the statistics in the census is James Stark. He's the first statistician in the General Register Office of Scotland. He's a medical man. He's interested in death in the cities. Particularly, he looks at the statistics for Glasgow, but there's nothing until he does the work in the 1840s in Edinburgh. Because who's recording death? Well, it's the local ministers, it's the gravediggers. It's very inconsistent until 1855. So again, those of you that do your family tree, you know this. 1855 is the key time when we have civil registration. It's also the same year that the Scottish Meteorological Society was formed. And Stark, first statistician in the General Register Office of Scotland, is also the first secretary of the Scottish Meteorological Society. So the two go together. And what he's interested in is the impact of climate variation, not climate change, but variation on death rates. So he's arguing that climate caused death, in particular for Scotland, the cold. He's interested in the impact of cold on death rates. So this is from the very first report, the first detailed annual report of the Registrar General. So it came out in 1861, but it's referring to that first report done from when there were William Pitt Dundas and Stark. Stark was the assistant to Dundas. This is their very first report. As weather, but more especially mean temperature, seems to exert a most potent influence on the health of the population. He then puts this table. And this table is to show you how the death rate in Scotland is increasing in the colder months. Most of the data hitherto they had on the impact on temperature and death, they came from soldiers around the world, the British Army, particularly in India. And there they saw the impact of heat, the southern states in the US as well, the impact of heat on the death rate. But when they looked at Scotland, they found the opposite. It was the cold that was killing. Here's the table here that was produced from that data. So the spike in the death rate in January and February, and then rising again as we get into December. So this is what influenced Stark. So he's there, the first statistician, he's working with the census. He writes up the analysis of the census each year while he's in post, each decade when he's in post. But then he's in between, he writes these detailed annual reports. So influence of temperature and mortality. This seemed to be very influential. And what I'm trying to get at is trying to understand why Scots might want to leave. I mentioned that in the 1770s for the Highlands, that's why there was this dance called America. Let's go to America, because the fragile economy and the fragile agricultural conditions were undermined by temperature drop. And here we're seeing a death rate higher in the winter months. And they looked at it also for different age groups and different kinds of disease. So for those of us around over 60, then you particularly see it there, the first quarter and the fourth quarter, the winter mortality is highest. So that for those above 60, we can see again that they're very much impacted by climate change. And what kind of diseases are killing us? It's consumption, it's anything to do with lungs, and then also like TB, that fits as zymotic diseases again to do with breathing and to do with disease of the lungs as well. So we've been looking at mortality and temperature, and actually they went even further and looked at different age groups, and actually younger people, 15 to 20, are not affected in the link between death rates and climate, whereas it's the older generation that are. And we can look at that, which is a little odd considering most those that leave tends to be of the younger generation, but those that remained, then we can see there's impact of climate on death. And this is still an issue. This is what today we call excess winter mortality. So this is data from 1950 up to early 2011, 2012. An excess winter mortality, which otherwise means more people dying than should because of the cold in the winter period, is actually is coming down in Scotland, but it's still a feature of our climate. Even though we're not that cold, we're not as cold as a Canadian winter, as Maggie will tell you. We're not as cold as here as a Canadian winter. We're not as cold as a Scandinavian winter, yet we have higher excess winter mortality. And that's partly to do with dampness. Well, a big part of it's to do with dampness and lack of quality housing. But that you can see that the trend is downwards, and that's partly to do with double glazing, to do with central heating. We'll get onto heat pumps before too long, but it's coming down. But it's still a feature, and it was certainly something that Stark noticed for the 19th century. And then they looked at this elsewhere. Again, this is the first detailed annual report. And they decide to say, well, okay, let's look at those trends for Scotland. What are they like in America? So they looked at New York and Massachusetts to see a general trend there. And what they find is, and I've just heard some terrible temperatures from people as we started, what they find here is, unlike in Scotland, the death rate in New York and Massachusetts goes up when the temperature goes up. So they come to the conclusion that, and then I've heard some people in the 90s and over 100 at the moment, if it's over 60 degrees Fahrenheit, look out. It's an impact on health. And this was the conclusion that Stark and his colleagues came up with. That as soon as the temperatures start to go up again, it gets past the 60s, 60 degrees Fahrenheit, then different kinds of diseases impact. Dysentery, diarrhea. They actually point out, if you want to be healthy in summertime in Scotland, go to Aberdeen. It has the least impact on your bowels because it has the coldest summers. But it convinced them that, okay, this is the reason that people are dying in Scotland. It's a cold. Compare that with places like New York and Massachusetts. It's different. This was the analysis that they came up with. And again, they looked at different kinds of diseases. This is Alexander Watt, who did some great work on Glasgow, on the death rate in Glasgow, looking at different age groups and comparing Glasgow and Edinburgh with New York and Philly to see what age of people are dying. So we're looking at measles, for example. Of those that die of measles in around 1842, over half, 50-odd%, are dying under the age of 2. In Glasgow, it's over 60% of the deaths are under the age of 2. In Edinburgh, New York, and Philadelphia, it's 47, 45. So it's showing again that there's distinctive climates are having a distinctive impact on the cause of disease. So under 5s are making up about 90% in both the US and in Scotland, under 5. So it's classic Victorian death rates. You know, once you make it past 5, you're doing okay. It's the death rate is at its very highest under 5. And Scotland in particular gets impacted for the under 2s in that case. They do the same for smallpox. And again, you see the difference here, but this time they put the difference down to the weakness of vaccination in Scotland. Scotland hasn't gone ahead. There's resistance to the vaccination. It's not yet compulsory in Scotland in this period. But for me, it's really interesting that both James Stark and Alexander Watt, who he worked with, are interested in comparing Edinburgh, Glasgow with New York, Philadelphia to try and see what it is about local climates that had an impact on the death rates. Okay, and where's the unhealthiest place to be in Scotland? It's the towns. This is looking at just the male and female death rate. Really want you to direct your eye to the town districts. They're the highest. So we know there's a lot of highland and lowland migration into the cities. People looking for jobs. We also now know that it's where the unhealthiest living conditions are. And so there was interest in particularly Stark to understand what urban climate had, what sort of impact did it have on those death rates. And this is the kind of stuff that they looked at, all the different diseases that they do. So if you look at that table, mean temperature, highest temperature, lowest temperature, rainfall, where the wind's coming from, and then its impact on lots of different diseases, from smallpox to measles to diarrhea to dysentery, even up to brain aneurysms and cancer. They looked at everything to see if there's a relationship. And James Stark, amongst many, was convinced that there was. So Scotland, climate-wise, was perhaps not the healthiest place to be. That's the conclusion that Stark is coming to. There's a reason to leave Scotland. There's a reason to seek out a better climate if you can. And these guys here, Thomas Carnelly, he at the University of Dundee has named a building after him. Here he is in the Dundee sewer looking for evidence of how unhealthy it was to live in the towns in the second half of the 19th century. He was actually commissioned to go down to the House of Commons to work out whether the sewers there were even unhealthier than Dundee's. And guess what? He found you know, he actually found that, that Dundee's was actually better than what he found in London under the hot air of the House of Commons. But they're looking to see why people are dying, to do with climate, to do with air quality. And this is some of the research that he did, looking at particles within air and, you know, comparing 4-roomed houses to 2 and to 1-roomed. And you can see there that the tighter the conditions, the more overcrowding, the more people crowded into one room. And this is not 1 bedroom, this is 1 room, or 2-roomed. And you can see the level of organic matter or carbonic acid in the atmosphere was higher. So Scotland was, second half of the 19th century, a predominantly urban nation. It was second only to, or second or third, to either England and the Netherlands as being the most urban nation in the second half of the 19th century. And it was the urban nation that was the most unhealthy part of it, a reason to consider perhaps emigrating. And so while there were laws of medicine, and they looked for laws of meteorology, they also looked for laws of emigration. This guy Ravenstein looked for the laws of emigration and included climate as one of the further inducements to leave. But they worked out, or they seemed to work out, that Scots could only go to certain parts of the world. They couldn't go to tropical countries. They'd never survive. The fair skin, the red hair, it would never survive. So they tried to analyze which parts of Empire and America they could go to. So this becomes an issue, or this becomes an inducement to emigrate, particularly to America, but to different parts. So climate becomes, well, we can't go there, but where can we go? And can we be healthier if we go there? This is not just going to Europe for a temporary health spa, for example, but this is trying to look for something long term. Where can we go? So where to go? So lots of information. We know that immigrants, when they sought out where to go, they looked for price of food, they looked for price of accommodation, price of land, of course. But they also sought out information on climate. They were told in the letters sent home what the weather was like. One of my favorite examples, a group of nuns who were persuaded to go off to Toronto, but they weren't told what the winter was like. So of course they go there in all happiness without any winter coats and then get a bit of a shock. But otherwise, people wanted to find out. They wanted to find out what the climate was like, and this is what they kind of sources that gave them information. These emigrants' guides, lots of letters home that would talk about the climate. One of the best sources of information was a government-produced pamphlet, that got bigger and bigger over the 19th century, called the Colonization Circular. This gave lots of practical information about when to go, the cost of passage, who was going to meet you there, how much clothing would cost, how much clothing you should take with you, what are the wages, what does food cost, but also about climate as well. You can see there on the right, just below gold mining is climate. That's one of the factors that they give there. So when to go to New Orleans, when to go to Texas, or should you go to Texas at all, given the soil and the climate that they would then find. So this is one of the issues that perhaps have been neglected. Yeah, absolutely, people go for a better life that in terms of wages, in land, but they also went, it's argued, for health reasons, for climate, for health reasons. And they were told about it. This is what we call boosting. You boast about North America, you boast about Canada and the US, about different parts. Here's a classic one. It's a little bit late, 1909, but these sentiments were said earlier as well, particularly for Highlanders that were fearful of depopulation. Well, wait a minute here. Come to Canada and you'll have many, many children, 6 or 7 children in as many years. Climate inducing much activity and boosting the population rate of Canada. But same arguments were made in the US as well, including lots of information about the lack of disease, for example. come to Chicago and it's a healthy, bracing environment. Disease is not known. Those kinds of statements were circulating around a lot. So boosting that North America, boosting also with lots of images. And sorry, these are a little bit blurred, but we've got Colorado in there, and we've got opening up of the West at the bottom three on the left. The other two are Canadian ones. The bottom right is one of the railway posters, for example. So presenting a beautiful climate. Of course, you're wanting to attract particular people, your particular immigrants that you're targeting for economic reasons, but climate was used as one of them, particularly about health and improvement of health. TB was such a big issue in Scotland. If you go to a dry climate, then it's argued it's much better. You won't suffer from TB. That was the argument. And in the 1880s, coming out of Montreal, but distributed all across the US, was Venner's weather bulletin, again giving agricultural advice, but also much more information as well, just about where to live and the health benefits of different parts of different states and different provinces. Lots of information, and this is where the science of meteorology was given to have a popular impact. It wasn't just confined to the scientists. It was being used in popular magazines to encourage people to emigrate, to go to somewhere safe. And I'm going to end with just some tables, just to give you some a bit of guesswork or a little bit of speculation here. And this is to say that absolutely people go when they've got financial support, if they get their passage subsidized. We've gone from indentured servants in the 18th century to, say, after the potato blight and assisted migration in 1851, when there's gold rush to California or gold rush over to Australia, New Zealand as well, then people go when there's periods of unemployment, such as the back of the Napoleonic Wars, and again, people are likely to leave. So there's dominant economic reasons that are there that cause people to emigrate. But as Ravenstein put it, climate is one of the further inducements. And what I've done here is I've plotted what information we have on annual sailings from Scotland, 1825 to 1850, so 25 years of data, and compared it to deviation from the mean. When there's a particular year of a particular distance, 1 or 2 degrees different from the mean temperature that we'd expect over that period. And you see a bit of a pattern here. It's fairly similar that following a period of either cold or extreme, there's then we then start to see some sailings following in. And what it's suggesting is that when there's an element of, say, extreme, not just the average, either too hot or too cold, then that's matching the kind of sailings that we're seeing. And this is something that James Stark plotted. He brought this data to the fore to try and look at what is the relationship between temperature change and sailings. This is giving it a little bit, this is also just looking at average temperature, but in the second half of the 19th century, 1850s, still a period called pre-industrial, as I said, from the very beginning. And again, you see a bit of a match there between the way that we can see temperature change and the popularity of sailings. Now, this is only indicative, as I say. The numbers sailing are absolutely shaped by when there's assistance, when there's a reason to go. If suddenly in Otago or in New Zealand they're paying passage and offering jobs, people will go. But we see in the general flow here, there's a pattern that's following. And if you look at that a little bit more detail here, so annual sailings is in black, and then look at, again, the red is showing the difference between the hottest and the coldest months. So what we're seeing here is a little bit of a delayed pattern. It's showing that there is some increase in sailings following on from a period of extreme in terms of highest difference between hottest and coldest months. And again, the same is showing with deviation from the mean. So it's suggestive that there is a shift between a delayed shift that's going on between climate variation beyond the norm and then the number of sailings. It's a bit of fun. As I say, I wouldn't see this as a causation, but it's an association rather, and it's showing some link between the two, which is interesting. And this is something, as I say, that James Stark looked at when he analysed the census. He looked at the numbers overseas and tried to look at the impact of climate on death rates and whether that then fed through on people trying to protect their health by emigrating. That's what motivated him, looking for the laws of meteorology that would help him explain laws of migration. So if there is a climate impact on health, we should see 2, 3, 4 years later an impact on sailings overseas as people sought out a healthier life to the one that they had at home and the one they were promised. Lots of variables, as I'm sure you can imagine, but this is what Stark and his contemporaries were looking at. And that takes me to the end. And I would say, has it stopped raining? It's probably about to start raining here, looking over Dundee at the moment. But this was the kind of data that we found starts from the 1820s, takes off particularly from the 1850s after the meteorological societies are formed in London. Maury does his work, Scotland formed in Edinburgh. Until then, we had just partial data, or we had John Constable painting the clouds. So this is the weather in, we've got the dates, so it's still the time there. This is 1822, between 11 and 12 noon, overlooking London. This is what the weather was like. Is it more accurate than the work that Clouston or the work that Fitzroy did, or Alexander Buchan in Scotland? Well, it's different, but it shows you how a science was developing, a science that was often criticised for just being antiquarianism, for collecting data for data's sake, and not really doing anything with it. This search for laws of immigration, laws of meteorology, was a way of giving credibility to this antiquarian activity of sitting out in the garden and recording how much rain or where the wind direction was. But it shows you the beginnings of a new science, and that new science and the data that was recorded, Mossman's data, is still used today as we try and look at climate change in Scotland. We still rely on this data. It's the best that we have. So it has a role. And so I think, for my work as a historian is to try and understand how that data was gathered and the reasons why people were looking into it. And, we now look for different issues. We now look about climate change, but for contemporaries, it was to do with the death rate and to do with the numbers that were leaving the country. And at that point, I shall stop. So thank you very much for listening. And I hope we can have some questions. That would be great. So thank you very much.
Well, bravo. I'll be the first to thank you. Very, very interesting. And what I would like to do is encourage everyone to unmute your mics and show yourselves on camera, and let's have some discussion. And Isabel Bell, I see you're here. And
I'm here. Hi, Graeme.
Hi, Isabel. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
one thing I was thinking about, Graeme, is, the discovery of penicillin, I believe, was 1928, thereabouts. And so some of these illnesses and diseases would have probably been worse in 1842. And
yes,
a lot of the data shown, the time frame that it originated from.
Yeah, this is still the period where they haven't quite worked out germ transfer. So they're beginning to do those experiments and looking at blood to see what's within it, but they're not quite sure, and there's still belief in miasma. So the way to good health, which is usually quite good, is wind. So if you've ever next time you go to Edinburgh, everyone, and you go to the National Museum of Scotland of Chambers Street. Chambers Street was created, and it's windy. You'll go there and you'll find it's windy. It was created to be windy because to give fresh air right through the heart of that join between the or that edge of the old town. So just above George IV Bridge, and so it's the idea that you blow away the wind. And what Cornelia was showing from the sewers that I was showing you is that in the city where there's no wind, or there's the wind can't take the disease out into the wider atmosphere, can't disperse it, then you're more likely to get lung diseases in particular. So when you're right, before this period of understanding germ transfer, it is all about the climate having the major determinant. So, often if you read, again, the statistical accounts of Scotland, which are really great sources, if you look at those online, the statistical accounts of Scotland in the 1790s and the 1840s, they tell you about the parish. So if your family's from a particular parish in Scotland, you can read all about it. And they talk about, well, when it's windy, that's good because it's clearing the air, they think. But where there's damp, then it's bad. And that's always, that has been Scotland's problem. And it's interesting that when we first got the Scottish Parliament in 1999, the first bit of legislation was about dealing with dampness in Scotland. So it has been a long-term problem in this climate, but also because of the housing that was then built wasn't suitable or hasn't been suitable to mitigate that climate or that dampness.
Graeme, is there any regulation to where you're putting weather stations? Do they have to? I was just stunned by that number of 3,200 weather stations in this small country of Scotland.
Yeah.
And yet, there's lots of different geography. So I understand that. And I then quickly just looked online for the US and we have 180,000. So I now see it's a popular science to measure science. So I just have no idea if there's any rhyme or reason to where you put them and how close they can be.
Well, I wonder if anyone here's got one in their backyard, because it's the kind of thing that people do. Come on, you've all got big backyards. This is what you do. If you're living outside the city, you can have your own weather station. But no, the period I was looking at, I mentioned this guy, Alexander Buchan. He used to go around and test the weather stations that people had set up. So if they wanted to be officially part of the Scottish Meteorological Society, he had to come and calibrate. And the society was visited by Prince Albert, Victoria and Albert. And he was, because he was impressed with all things science. And he was a great patron of the sciences in the UK. And he came round to see that calibration work going on, because you're right, there's a danger that you're getting dodgy data because of where it's cited. So there's not regulation, but there's lots of guidance on where you put those. And there's still, but although today, when you see weather records, sometimes some of the sites are not acknowledged as being suitable. So, is it in the sun, for example, or the nature of the technology that's used to measure it? So there's increasing standardization, and that's one of the activities that goes on from the 1850s, because they're very conscious of that. And down near where Connie is, in Eskdale Muir, there's a great weather station there that was set up by the London Met Office because they wanted to record, I think it was ground temperature, but also they wanted their measurements to be free from the vibrations of the London Underground. So they measured in London, but because of the London Underground, it impacted on their measurements. So they took, let's go to Eskdale Muir in the Borders and measure there where they would not be impacted. So yeah, there is that kind of concern about where you set these up, and again, that's, as I said, about Ben Nevis, because that was very much set up to chart the major sort of west to east wind and storm activity in Scotland at the highest point.
Graeme, do you have any data on the future? Because I was sort of expecting you to predict that America is going to continue to warm up and Scotland's going to continue to cool off. But do you have any information on the future at all?
Well, yeah, well, actually, our local newspaper in Dundee, the Dundee Courier, was just saying that just up the road from us, Montrose, they're predicting it's going to be underwater in 20, 30 years if something doesn't change. So for Scotland, it's rising sea levels. It seems to be the big impact. So I remember there was a talk 2 or 3 years ago by sort of a government agency, and that seemed to be the main concern was soil erosion or coastal erosion and rising sea level. So again, that's partly to do with temperature change, so the ice melt going, for example, but also climate change has an impact on the height of waves. So waves are so it basically exacerbates storm action, exacerbates wave height, and that can have an impact on coastal erosion as well. So it's low-lying areas in around Scotland that seem to be under threat. I wouldn't presume to have enough knowledge to say what's going to happen in the US, but listening to what people were saying at the start, and I've got a PhD student in Phoenix, Arizona, who just wows me with the temperatures that he's experiencing, and he just loves coming to Scotland to cool down, so. But I don't know enough about the US climate to say what's going to happen. But I know there's it's a lot of political debate about it, and it's become very politicized. But it's yet another year where records have changed, records are broken, and for the historian, you kind of try and work out, well, what's a long term, what's a long period. I've looked at the 19th, 20th century. Should we go back to the medieval period, the Little Ice Age, taking it right through to the 1750s? What sort of period should you compare against? But I think certainly we're seeing quite dramatic records broken almost every year now. The records have been broken, and as I say, it started off with that fear of the 1.5 and at a global temperature.
Yes, and for those of you who haven't looked, it's 53 degrees in Edinburgh today, July 13th. So
Yeah.
you need a coat.
Exactly.
It's always windy.
I was tempted with the heating this morning.
So do you have any information, Graeme, on the Outer Hebrides? The US, Harris, and so forth. I mean, are they eroding rapidly, or what's the
I don't. The issue there is you're right. The soil erosion is there. It's a coastal erosion rather is a major problem. And when I know historically, again, if the statistical accounts of Scotland, I always recommend go and have a look at those online. They're free to use. They're great. But they talk a lot about basically the spray from salt water. If you want to get rid of your weeds, spray from salt water, and it's great for getting rid of weeds, but that also impacts crops as well. So the coastal parts of Scotland are impacted by the increasing spray, but they're also impacted by the length of the growing season. So if that gets impacted as well, and basically it's the idea, it's the old F word, fragile. It's a fragile economy and a fragile ecosystem, and any fundamental change to that is at risk. So I think that's the kind of issue. There's not a lot of leeway. My old supervisor used to describe a lot of Scotland as the soil is like the back of your hand, hard and bony. There's not a lot of fat there, and so there's not a lot of deep soil to use, and that makes it a very fragile environment. And I think, and certainly historically, again, I was really interested in how parts of America were just sold, parts of Canada as well, of having this wonderful soil, the deepness of the soil, the richness of the soil, and you could, the ease of growth. So they talk about all these exotic fruits you could grow as well in different parts of North America. So, you know, things you could never dream of growing in Scotland. Wheat, for example, can't grow because it is too high above, certainly past East Lothian, really, because it's too high above sea level. So hence why oats are so popular in Scotland, because you can grow oats given the height above sea level and the wider climate. So those sorts of issues are really fundamental to what you can grow and livelihood. So yeah, it's a fragility, I think, and that's what you see. Some of the arguments about climate change today is not so much for the industrial nations, but it's other parts of the world where they have very either a very again fragile societies, fragile economies, and any change there is seen as much more catastrophic, leading to migration, for example. All those issues, as well as starvation, are part of it. And so there's lots of arguments about, you know, Malthus and starvation coming back again because of the impact of climate on agricultural production.
Gus, do you have your hand up? Someone from Chicago Scots has a hand showing. Guess not. Randy?
Connie, my video is blocked. I can't.
I'll see if I can help you.
I can't start my video.
Okay, I'll try to help you, Randy.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Yep, sure.
Hi, this is Liz, Amy. I'm joining you today from Seattle.
How's Seattle today?
You know, actually, it's pretty mild at the moment. So it's about 66 degrees, but we're headed back up to 83. We just survived last week some record-breaking 93, 94, 95 degrees. So yeah.
Ouch, ouch.
I was going to ask about the role of peat bogs in Scotland in terms of climate change. If there's anything that you might be able to share about that.
Oh, that's a good question. I wish I knew more. Other than absolutely their importance, I know it's peat bogs were, you know, dug up effectively. The peat was used, the peat was burnt, and that contributes to CO2s in the air. So I think there's a move away from digging up and using peat and preserving it. So I think it's the story now is, where possible, is to leave it where it is, because it does wonderful things where it is. But if you dig it up and use it, then it's a bit more negative. Because I think, because one of the things, air quality is increasingly back in the agenda for again impact on asthma, on any kind of lung issues or blocked lung, even and as well as the wider developments of TB as well. But so, you know, if you think, if you know of Edinburgh as Old Reekie, was always its nickname, because always having all the smoke. It started having smokeless fuel legislation from the 1950s to try and improve it.
Oh, interesting.
So it's you know, there has been awareness of the impact of smoke, and also, you know, your classic burning peat in a croft without a chimney is, again, not the healthiest thing in the world. So yeah, I don't know enough about peat bogs, but I think your instinct is right, that's one of the issues that we're trying to maintain those peat bogs as being, you know, a positive thing to do, rather than dig them up. I think that would be my answer.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, that's what I'm seeing too, is that it's a carbon sink.
Yeah, I think that's right.
You know, that it'll grab more of the CO2 out of the atmosphere, as long as we don't dig it up and burn it.
Burn it, exactly. Yeah, thanks. Yes, I think that's a good
Thank
point.
you.
Yeah. Yeah, this is Randy.
Hi,
I
Randy.
can see the effect of heat in my front yard. My grass was very browned out. I've got a tree which looks like it's close to being gone. I've got plants and bushes. Like I said, we had 104-degree high temperature last week. They've been reporting in the newspapers that the local governments are setting up these sites where people can come in and get hydrated and everything. So
Ah,
heat is in agriculture.
mm.
I've read recently that corn is being affected by the heat, so it touches on a lot of different places.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, again, from the times in Canada that the malls were used as places to hide from the heat if you could protect yourself
Yeah.
from the heat when there was a heat alert that's going on. Again, one of the newspapers in the UK was talking about some workers in France, wake up in the morning, go to work and die from heat exhaustion at
Hmm.
the end of the day.
Yeah.
So there is data on the impact of heat on the death rate, and absolutely is an issue. It's just not such a common one in Scotland, as I say.
Yeah.
It tends to
Yeah.
be, but we do see it whenever there is. You know what the Scots are like. As soon as there's 5 minutes of sun, and they're out there trying to
Yeah.
go as pink as possible. Yeah.
Well, the Scottish Open's being played this weekend, and I didn't go out and play golf last week at the Raleigh Golf Association because it was too
Yeah.
dark.
Yeah, well, usually you play golf in this country in the rain. I still have memories of Tiger Woods going around St Andrews and absolutely uh, pelting down rain. I wondering what
Hmm.
life is about. But uh, but you're right.
Hmm.
I think that those variations, those extremes now, and I think that's what people are noticing more, because it's a question about, okay, you look at averages, that's one thing, and a slight increase in average. But it's the extremes, and that's what scientists are arguing, that climate change is really showing its danger to us, is it exacerbates those extremes. It makes them, the spikes, the highs and lows, so much more. And I think that's what these 19th century scientists were interested in, is looking at the average, and that's kind of what's okay. But when you start going above the average, and then you start looking at, well, what's the extreme between
Yeah.
the difference between the highest and the lowest point? How late does the temperature in Scotland reach its highest point?
Hmm.
So looked at that kind of data. So they got more and more sophisticated looking at that, and then they started combining it with that kind of medical climatology,
Hmm.
which was they started to get interested in things like they got some data on the people that built the new town in Edinburgh, the dust from cutting the stone, and
Hmm.
so combined that stone cutting and again the lung disease that came from that with black lung amongst miners, and
Hmm.
then so it's putting those two bits together about, okay, there's industrial disease because of dust from coal or from cutting
Hmm.
stone. That has an impact. Well, wait a minute. So Connelly then looked at, he basically went around people's bedrooms and measured air quality. I don't know how he got
Hmm.
access to people's bedrooms late at night, but he did measure them and compared bedrooms with schools and factories just to look at what was the internal air quality. And then say, okay, so air quality, what's the particles in the air? That's having an impact. What happens when the wind blows or when the wind can't blow it anywhere?
Hmm.
So he compared Dundee and Perth and found that it's actually those parts of the city where the wind has nowhere to go. And it kind of confirms what we always knew. Again, the classic story about the tenement buildings in Scotland, if you're living in the middle of the tenement, the high rises, if you're in the middle, you're okay. If you're at the top, well, it's a long way to go, there's no lift. But if you're at the bottom, then you've got everyone's mess around you. And that's the unhealthiest part of living in an urban Scotland in the 19th or early 20th century.
Yeah.
Particularly if you live in a basement or a cul-de-sac where there's only one way in and one way out, and that's the unhealthy part.
Hmm.
I'll just share that famous old joke. I love summer in Scotland. It's my favorite day of the year.
Aha, boom, boom. Yeah,
Graham,
that's the day every Scot runs out to go and get the suntan.
We had that day. We had that day, and I thought, oh gosh,
That's
it's
it.
hot. Summer must be here. And then it was gone. And we haven't had that day again.
You
Did
know that.
everybody
You
run
can
out
tell the
too?
British people in America because they're carrying their coat.
Graham, a question.
Uh-huh.
I've been doing a lot of work on artificial intelligence. And is that being used extensively in this collecting this data and trying to analyze it?
I can say I don't know, but I can imagine absolutely in terms of modeling what's going on. I think it's being used in terms of, Connie asked me about the future. I think that's what it's been used for. How far in the future can you tell? And I think that's, the kind of, I'll give you a complete opposite, which I told you about Admiral Fitzroy, who was the Met Office guy, started the Met Office, the Meteorological Office in London. He was criticised for not because basically what he tried to do was predict when there would be a storm and therefore not to go out to sea. So he looked at the barometer, the air pressure that was going on, charted it from Scotland down the west coast over to Ireland, down to the south coast over to France. It charted the air pressure, and then they worked out if a storm was going to come. And he would then write to the Scotsman newspaper or any other newspapers and say a storm's going to come. And if he was wrong, all the ship owners would go, well, I've wasted a day, I've lost money. And he was so criticised over this that he eventually commits suicide because he couldn't cope with the pressure. So what we're seeing today with artificial intelligence is trying to get those predictions in the future, not only what's happening now, but predictions in the future. So yeah, I think it's not my field, but absolutely I can see artificial intelligence being used for that, because that's from what I can see anyway. It seems to be one of the great gains. We see it in medical research as well, is that ability to predict patterns from so many different variables. And I think that's the thing that Fitzroy, with only limited staff, struggled with the variables that he had, but we have many more data points. And so how many in the US? How many weather stations? How much data points do we have? That it's, we used to use supercomputers. Now I think we're using artificial intelligence to do that.
This has been so interesting. I lost track of the time. I think we probably have time for one more comment from somebody. Any other discussion items today?
Yeah, just one thing, Graham. I know there's no trees in the islands, in the Hebrides. Could you tell folks why?
It's windy.
It's windy. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember
That
last
reminds
time.
me of an old Billy Connolly joke.
Mhm.
He said if it rains in the Hebrides, he said you better duck in Norway.
Yes, it's true.
I think it's that salt water too, is it not, Graham? Because I was told by some folks in Aberdeen that, because I said, where are the trees? There just aren't any trees. And it's the winds coming in off the water with all the salt.
So that's the impact on the Hebrides. Absolutely, that's the big one. Shetland in particular is notorious for lacking trees, but yeah, because that's one again, back to the idea of extremes. I showed you Charles Clouston, the man with the best beard. He wins the best beard. He's a ZZ Top guy. He's got the best beard down to there. Charles Clouston on Orkney Islands, and he pointed out that his measurements in the 1820s, 1840s, the Orkney average temperature was basically the same as where you are, Connie, around in Dumfries and the borders. It wasn't that much different. But what was different was the extremes of the wind that you get, and the impact of the wind in Orkney, Shetland as well, which again is an impact of an extreme, and that's a big issue that that he identified. And it's the danger of us just using averages, because averages just hide those levels of extreme. Climate change is showing us the average is going up. So that's something to worry about. But I think as we've been discussing, it's the impact of that on the peaks and the troughs. Either the cold or the heat. I think that, or the same with rising sea temperature, and then the rising wave height. That's all been documented, and that's all coming about because of the impact of that wider climate change.
John Manchester, you have your hand up, do you not? See if I can help him get unmuted.
Oh,
Actually,
John.
I just had my hand on my head, Connie, so I wasn't raising it.
Oh, okay.
I will say that we're looking at some extreme heat back here in Chicago, so you're better off where you are, Connie, trust me.
I just remember the snow the last time I was in Chicago. I just remember the cold gusts dragged me through the snow to come visit. I missed why did he not drag me through the heat? That would have been lovely.
That must have been a ways back.
It was a way back, yes, the days of snow.
Well, it's been very fascinating, Graeme, talking with you today, and we're really appreciative of you making time for us.
Well,
and
great questions.
Yes, and I know everyone has really enjoyed this. So we will be in touch to follow up with you, as I mentioned. And I just want to thank everybody for being here today. We had a big group. Some of them have dropped off, but hope to see you again next month. You too, Graeme. You're welcome to join our group. We'd love to have you.
That'd be lovely. Thank you.
Until then, be safe and thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Maggie.
Thank you. Thank you, Graeme.
Bye. Thanks all.
Yeah.
Bye,
Very
everyone.
interesting.
Take care.
Good.